My name is Emily Carter. The same hands that were once steady enough to earn me the Top Surgeon of the Year award from Chicago Medical Center were the very same hands that, just last week, signed a 7-year-old boy's death certificate. For 2 decades, I have been a god in a sterile white coat, a celebrated surgeon in one of the city's most demanding hospitals. I commanded operating rooms, defied death on a daily basis, and believed with every fiber of my being that skill, science, and the sheer force of my will were the only trinity that mattered. I saved lives. That was my identity, my purpose, my everything. But the day I took one by mistake, I learned that a God who bleeds is no God at all. To understand how I fell, you must first understand how high I had climbed. You have to picture the sacrifice. Imagine 20 years of 80-hour workweeks, of missed birthdays and canceled vacations. Picture me choosing the acrid smell of antiseptic over the scent of my mother's Thanksgiving turkey year after year. I traded a personal life for the privilege of saving the lives of strangers. My white coat wasn't just a uniform. It was my armor, my skin. Each successful surgery added another layer of steel. Each grateful family another testament to my worth. I was respected, revered, and utterly dedicated. But this dedication came at a cost that was invisible to everyone else. They saw the success, the awards, the unwavering confidence. They didn't see the woman who ate dinner alone from a vending machine at 2 a.m., the woman who hadn't had a genuine, soul-bearing conversation in years, the woman whose apartment was less of a home and more of a quiet, empty place to store her exhaustion before the next shift began. I gave my entire life to my craft, believing it was a noble sacrifice. I was wrong. It was a foolish trade. The core of my story, the ugly, shattering truth, isn't just that I made a mistake. The true conflict is the crushing realization that my life's foundation was built on sand. For years, I felt a creeping emptiness, a hollow ache in my soul that no surgical success could fill. I dismissed it as fatigue, the price of greatness. But it was something more sinister. It was the slow starvation of my spirit. I remember as a little girl, kneeling by my bed, my small hands clasped together, whispering my hopes and fears into the darkness. I believed someone was listening. That little girl vanished somewhere between my medical school residency and my first life or death procedure. I placed my faith not in God, but in my own 2 hands. The shocking injustice isn't that my hands finally failed me. It's that I sacrificed my soul for them, only to discover they were never enough to save me. Maybe this story is your story too. Have you ever poured your entire being into something? A career? A relationship, a dream, only to wake up one day and realize it has taken more from you than it has given? Maybe you're not a surgeon, but you know the feeling of running on empty, of smiling through a deep, unnamed exhaustion. You know what it's like to build your identity on a single pillar, and you live with the quiet terror of what would happen if that pillar crumbled. What happens when the one thing that defines you is stripped away? Who are you then? You chase success with the ferocity of a predator, believing it will finally make you feel whole, only to stand at the summit and feel more alone than ever before. That was me. Lost, celebrated, and utterly, profoundly alone. But this is not just a story about falling. It's about what happens when you hit the bottom. It's about the moment when the silence is so deafening that you are forced to listen to the whisper you've been ignoring for decades. For me, that moment came in the sterile quiet of the hospital parking garage, the city lights of Chicago blurring through my tear-filled eyes. There, in the wreckage of my life, stripped of my pride and my purpose, I was about to discover that a prayer is not always an act of faith. Sometimes it is the last desperate breath you take before you drown. It is the beginning of a rescue you never knew you needed. God, I don't know if you still listen, but I'm so tired. Sleep isn't a refuge in my world. It's a debt you can never fully repay. The morning of the mistake began not with a gentle awakening, but with the violent shriek of my pager at 4:30 a.m., a summons from an emergency that had bled into the dawn. I had been on call, and the night had been a brutal marathon of ruptured appendices and internal bleeding, leaving me with perhaps 90 minutes of fractured, dreamless rest on a lumpy couch in the doctor's lounge. My first conscious thought wasn't of the new day, but a cold, hard calculation. I had 3 complex surgeries scheduled back to back, starting in less than 3 hours. There was a raw, metallic taste in my mouth, and the triple-shot espresso I choked down felt less like a comfort and more like a desperate command to my already frayed nervous system. My body was a machine running on fumes, and I was the one whipping it to keep going. My entire career was built on moments like this, on pushing past the limits of human endurance. It was a badge of honor in the surgical world. We were warriors, gladiators, and scrubs, and exhaustion was just part of the battle. My sacrifice was my strength, or so I told myself. I had given up the simple, restorative rhythm of a normal life for this relentless pace. I had traded the warmth of a bed for the cold, sterile light of the hospital. For what? For the lives I saved, for the reputation I had meticulously built. But that morning something felt different. The armor felt thinner, the weight of the day heavier. When I reviewed my surgical list, my eyes landed on the second case. Liam Miller, 7 years old, with a rare congenital heart defect. His file included a photo, a smiling, gap-toothed kid with a mop of sandy blonde hair. And for the first time in a long time, looking at a patient's face didn't fill me with determination. It filled me with a strange, formless dread. This is where the real conflict began, not in the operating room but inside my own head. A quiet alarm started ringing in the back of my mind, a primal instinct screaming that I was too tired, that my focus was compromised, that something was wrong. But I silenced it with the brutal efficiency I had honed over 20 years. I was Dr. Emily Carter. I didn't operate on feelings, I operated on patients. I had performed more complex procedures in worse conditions. To admit weakness, even to myself, felt like a betrayal of everything I stood for. The system I thrived in didn't allow for weakness. It demanded perfection regardless of the human cost. So I pushed the feeling down, labeling it as simple pre-surgery jitters, a symptom of caffeine and sleep deprivation. The injustice was this: I was a human being treated like a machine, and I was the one enforcing the protocol. Have you ever felt that? A quiet warning in your gut, a clear, cold feeling that you are about to step over a line you shouldn't cross. Maybe it was before sending an angry email, making a risky financial decision, or simply pushing yourself to go to a social event when your soul was screaming for rest. You hear the alarm, you feel the resistance, but you ignore it. You tell yourself to be logical, to be strong, to just push through. You silence that wise, ancient part of your own spirit because the world, your boss, your family, or your own ambition demands that you keep moving forward. You choose to trust your exhausted mind over your intuitive heart. That was me walking towards the scrub sink, my pride drowning out the desperate whispers of my own soul. As I held my hands under the scalding water, I saw that they had the slightest tremor, almost imperceptible, but I knew it was there. These were the hands that had brought me everything, my career, my identity, my pride. They were famous in this hospital for their steadiness. But that morning they felt like they belonged to someone else. The vague anxiety I'd felt earlier was now crystallizing into a cold, sharp premonition. Something was about to go terribly wrong. I knew it with a certainty that defied all logic and science. And as I walked toward the operating room where that little boy was waiting, I found myself murmuring words I hadn't meant to say, a desperate plea from a part of me I had long since buried. Lord, keep my hands steady, even if I can't feel you anymore. The most terrifying sound in the world isn't a scream. It's the sudden absolute silence that follows the long unbroken tone of a flatlined heart monitor. It's the sound of an ending, of a life just extinguished, and it was the symphony I composed myself in operating room for that day. The OR had been my sanctuary, a world of order where every movement was calculated, every tool had a purpose. But in a moment my sanctuary became my own private hell, and I was the demon holding the scalpel. Everything had been going deceptively smoothly. My team, a well-oiled machine, moved with practiced precision. On the outside I was a statue of calm, my voice clear and decisive through my mask, calling out commands. But on the inside I was fighting a fog of exhaustion. Every decision felt a little heavier, every movement required a monumental act of will. Looking down at Liam's small form on the table, a feeling of guilt crept in. This boy deserved the best version of me, a sharp and energized Dr. Carter. Instead, he got a weary imitation, a ghost running on muscle memory. I had placed my pride and my stubbornness above his safety. I had sacrificed him to my ego. And then it happened. Not a large, obvious error, but something worse. A tiny, subtle, unfixable one. A split-second decision made by a sleep-deprived brain led to a cut that was 1 millimeter off course. 1 millimeter. In pediatric cardiac surgery, a millimeter is a canyon. Instantly, the monitors that had been charting Liam's steady rhythm began to scream. The green numbers plummeted. The shrill alarm ripped through the controlled quiet of the room. Chaos erupted. Heart rate dropping. "We have arterial bleeding," a nurse yelled. Cold adrenaline flooded my system, but it brought no clarity, only panic. The next few minutes were a blurred, frantic mess of shouted commands, blood-soaked gauze, and the hopeless static crack of the defibrillator paddles. But the small heart was silent. The head of anesthesiology looked at me, his eyes over his mask holding a truth I couldn't face. He shook his head. It was over. Have you ever had a moment like that? A single second that cleaves your life into two distinct parts, before and after. Maybe it wasn't a scalpel. Maybe it was a cruel word you can never take back. A text message you wish you'd never sent. A turn of the steering wheel that changed everything forever. A tiny, insignificant moment, but it carries the weight of permanence. You replay it over and over, wondering why, how everything could have collapsed so fast. You would give anything in the world to rewind the clock by 1 second. But you can't. And you have to live with the echo of that moment for the rest of your life. That is where I was, in the screaming silence of my failure. I stood there, frozen, my gloved hands stained with blood that was not my own. My team, my trusted colleagues, now avoided my eyes. They cleaned up quietly, their movements slowed by the gravity of what had just happened. I was no longer Dr. Carter, top surgeon. I was a failure. I was a cautionary tale. I had taken a life I had sworn to protect. And in the shattered silence of my own soul, a prayer arose. Not the polite, conscious prayer of the little girl I used to be, but a raw, desperate scream from the bottom of a guilty abyss. Please, please let him live. Don't let my hands be the end of him. They declared the time of death at 11:42 a.m., but no one declared the time of death for my career, for the person I used to be. No one teaches you how to be a ghost in your own life. I walked out of operating room 4. But a part of me will never leave. It will forever be trapped in the deafening silence that followed the last beep, forever stained by the cold surgical lights and the faint smell of blood in the air. I was a phantom in a white coat, walking hallways I used to command with power and purpose. Every step from the OR to the locker room was torture. Colleagues who once looked at me with respect now suddenly found the floor fascinating. Their gaze was an indictment more painful than any words. They didn't see a surgeon who had made a mistake. They saw a contagion, a warning of their own fragility. I was the embodiment of their worst fear. I had spent my life building a fortress of reputation around myself, believing it would protect me. But in a single morning, that fortress had crumbled to dust, and I realized I had sacrificed family, friendship, and my own soul to protect something that wasn't real. The emptiness I felt wasn't just grief. It was the bankruptcy of a lifetime. The core conflict was no longer about a misplaced scalpel. It was the devastating, unbearable truth waiting for me down the hall. Through the glass of the surgical waiting area, I saw her, Liam's mother. She was sitting on the edge of her seat, leaning slightly forward, her eyes locked on the door she expected me to walk through with a smile and good news. Her face was a painful mixture of hope and fear, a fragility I was about to shatter. Our eyes met for a single shattering second. In that moment, she didn't see a failed surgeon. She saw hope. And I, seeing that pure, unblemished trust, felt a wave of self-loathing so profound it choked me. I hurried away, my heart pounding. The horrible injustice was this. I was carrying a truth that would destroy her world, and my own cowardice wouldn't let me face her. Have you ever felt a guilt so heavy you just wanted to become invisible? You know the feeling. The feeling when you see the person you've wronged across the street, and you quickly turn down another block. The feeling of avoiding your boss's eyes after a major mistake. It's a physical sensation, your shoulders slump, your eyes are glued to the floor, and you pray for the ground to crack open and swallow you whole. You would do anything to avoid witnessing the pain you caused on someone else's face, because seeing it makes it real. For me, that mother's gaze through the glass was a mirror reflecting my complete failure as a doctor and as a human being. I finally made it to the women's locker room, shutting the door and leaning against it as if it could hold the world at bay. Exhaustion hit me like a tidal wave, powerful and cruel. I slid down to the floor, my white coat feeling like a shroud. My entire life had been built on control and precision, but now all of it was broken. I was completely empty, with nothing left to give. In the silence of that cold room, amid the smell of sweat and antiseptic, I realized this collapse wasn't a single event. It was the result of years of neglecting my own soul. And in that total brokenness, with nothing left to hold on to, a prayer was formed, not from strength but from utter desperation. I don't deserve your mercy, but I ask it anyway, for him, for his mother, and for my broken soul. There are two kinds of people who go to the hospital rooftop: those who need a breath of fresh air, and those who are contemplating the finality of the drop. That night, under a sky full of indifferent Chicago stars, I was the latter. I couldn't go home to the crushing silence of my apartment, and I couldn't stay inside the building where every corridor echoed with my failure. So I took the service elevator up, seeking an escape that felt as absolute as the mistake I had made. The wind was cold and sharp against my face, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat of my shame. Below me, the city glittered, a beautiful, sprawling galaxy of light and life that I no longer felt a part of. My entire life had been a singular, obsessive climb to this very vantage point. Not this rooftop specifically, but to the pinnacle of my profession, where I could look out and see the fruits of my sacrifice. I had given up everything for this. I had traded the warmth of a family for the cold reality of the morgue. I had sacrificed holidays, friendships, and the chance at love for the sterile embrace of the operating room. I did it all believing I was serving this city, this sea of lights below. But now that sacrifice felt like a fool's bargain. The city didn't care. It kept humming and moving, its pulse steady while mine was threatening to stop. I had given my life to my career, and my career had just killed a child. The stakes were no longer about my reputation, they were about my very existence. The core conflict that pushed me toward the ledge was a simple, brutal piece of math. I had spent 20 years saving lives, but in my mind that single fatal mistake had erased it all. The ledger was no longer in the positive. The injustice of it was a bitter poison in my throat. One mistake, born of exhaustion from the very job I had given my life to, had negated every good thing I had ever done. The shocking truth I faced was that my hands, once instruments of healing, were now instruments of death. They were tainted. I couldn't trust them anymore. How could I ever walk into an or again, knowing what they were capable of? The thought wasn't just terrifying, it was nauseating. The world already had one less child because of me. Perhaps it was time to balance the scales. Have you ever stood in that place? The place where the future seems like a series of rooms, and every single door leads to more pain? Maybe you weren't standing on a physical ledge, but you've stood at the edge of your own abyss. It's that moment where giving up feels less like a choice and more like a logical conclusion, a final merciful surrender. You fought so hard for so long and you are just so tired of fighting. You look at the wreckage of your life, at the people you've hurt, at the person you've become, and the silence seems to offer a kinder alternative than facing another sunrise. You know that feeling, don't you? The seductive whisper of it could all be over. I took a step closer to the edge, the rough concrete scraping under my worn hospital shoes. I closed my eyes, letting the wind be the last thing I felt. And then a sound cut through the night. It wasn't a whisper from God or a sudden epiphany. It was the shrill, piercing wail of an ambulance siren rising from the streets far below. It was a sound I had heard 1,000 times, but that night it was different. It wasn't just noise, it was a scream of purpose. It was the sound of a team rushing to help, of a life hanging in the balance, of a fight that wasn't over yet. It was the sound of the world I was about to leave, reminding me that even in my personal hell, the work of saving lives continued. It didn't offer me peace or forgiveness. It offered me a question, and it pulled me back from the brink. If there's still purpose for me, show me before I let go. I don't know what led me there. After stepping back from the rooftop's edge, I wandered the hospital's quiet corridors like a ghost. I couldn't go home. I couldn't stay in the familiar places. The doctor's lounge now felt like a club from which I'd been excommunicated. My office with its framed accolades felt like a mockery. And I couldn't even think about it. So I just walked aimless, a lost soul in the very kingdom I once ruled, until I found myself standing before a simple wooden door I had passed thousands of times over 20 years but had never truly seen, the hospital chapel. Throughout my career, I had placed my faith in the measurable. Blood pressure, heart rates, lab results. I had sacrificed sleep, relationships, and my own peace of mind on the altar of science and precision. I had shouldered the burden of life and death on my own, believing I needed no help from an unseen power. But now, with everything I believed in shattered, with the hands I worshipped having betrayed me, I stood there, utterly depleted and empty. I had nowhere else to go. Stepping into the chapel was not an act of faith. It was the final act of a person in surrender, someone who had exhausted every other option. The core conflict was no longer between me and the world. It was within me. The doctor in me, the scientist, was screaming silently. What is this, Emily? A room with pews and old symbols? It won't bring Liam back. It won't fix your mistake. The shocking injustice was the bitter irony that my logical, orderly world had completely failed to bring me an ounce of peace, forcing me toward the one place I had spent my life mocking and ignoring. Have you ever been there? Not necessarily a chapel. Maybe a park bench at midnight, the driver's seat in an empty parking lot, or just the cold floor of your bathroom. It's that moment when you've run from everything and finally there's nowhere left to run from yourself. You have hit the bottom, where all your self-confidence and control have dissolved. All you crave is not a solution but just a moment of quiet, a shelter from the storm in your mind, a place to breathe when you feel like you're drowning. For me, at that dawn, this wooden door was that place. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was still and cool. I sat in a back pew, and just then, the first rays of dawn broke through the simple stained glass windows. The light wasn't brilliant or blinding. It was soft, gentle, casting streaks of amber and cobalt on the empty pews. And in that light, a memory surfaced unexpectedly from the deep, one I didn't know I still had. The image of me as a little girl, sitting beside my mother in church, her warm hand holding mine. It was the promise of something different, a new beginning. It wasn't an answer, but it was the first hint of hope in a long, dark night. And a question, a prayer, formed on my lips, trembling and uncertain. God, it's been so long. Do you still remember me? Before I learned how to save a life with a scalpel, I learned how to save my own soul with a whisper. Sitting in the cold, quiet chapel, the scent of old wood and faint incense triggered a memory so vivid it felt like time travel. I wasn't a broken 41-year-old surgeon anymore. I was 5 years old, tucked into bed, the sheets pulled up to my chin. The shadows on the wall, cast by the hallway light, looked like grasping monsters, and a primal childhood fear had my heart beating fast. My mother sat on the edge of my bed, her presence a warm protective shield against the dark. She was the one who taught me. She saw the fear in my eyes and understood that checking under the bed wasn't enough. She taught me to clasp my hands together, and she whispered, "Just tell God what's on your heart, Emily. He's always listening." I remember the feeling of my small hands pressed together, the sound of my own quiet voice whispering about the shadows, and then a profound sense of peace settling over me. The fear didn't vanish, but it was joined by a warmth, a deep-seated feeling that I was not alone. It was the first time I felt the tangible comfort of faith. It was a gift freely given, a sacrifice made for me by a loving God before I even knew what sacrifice meant. 4 years, that simple act was my anchor in the small storms of childhood. The core conflict, the true tragedy, wasn't that I simply forgot to pray. It was that I actively chose to abandon it. The day I walked into medical school, I walked into a world that demanded empirical evidence and tangible proof. Faith became an unprovable variable in a world of precise equations. I watched my professors, brilliant men and women of science, and I saw their power. They held life and death in their hands, not through prayer, but through knowledge, skill, and grueling, relentless work. I began to see faith as a crutch, a comforting story for those who couldn't handle the cold, hard facts of existence. I made a conscious decision. I would put my faith not in an unseen God, but in my own 2 hands. The shocking injustice I see now is that I traded the infinite, unconditional love I felt as a child for the conditional, fleeting approval of the world. Haven't you done that, too, in some way? Haven't you ever traded a piece of your soul for something you thought was more valuable? Maybe you abandoned a love for art for a more sensible career. Maybe you silenced that intuitive voice in your gut because it didn't align with the logical pro and con list. You took a younger, softer version of yourself, the one who believed in magic or wrote poetry or simply trusted people without question, and you locked that part of you away because you decided it was too naive for the real world. You made a trade, convincing yourself it was for the best, only to find yourself years later with a hollow space where that essential part of you used to be. Sitting there as the dawn bled through the stained glass, that memory of my mother was no longer just a nostalgic echo. It was a map. It was a faint light from a distant shore, showing me where I had come from, and by extension, showing me the way back. The journey ahead wasn't just about recovering from a professional failure anymore. It was about recovering a fundamental part of myself that I had intentionally discarded. The promise wasn't that the path would be easy, but for the first time since Liam's death, there was the hint of a path at all. And it began with a single faltering step, a prayer that was both an apology and a plea. Help me find my way back to the faith I left behind. There are two trials that follow a fatal mistake. The first is held by other people, in a sterile conference room with a long polished table and glasses of ice water that you're too nauseous to drink. The second, far more terrifying trial, is held in the unrelenting quiet of your own heart. I stood trial before the hospital's leadership board on a Tuesday morning. They wanted my badge, my license, my career. What they didn't understand was that I had already surrendered something far more valuable: the illusion that I was ever in control. I walked into that room a ghost of the surgeon they had once celebrated. My white coat, my armor was gone, replaced by a simple black dress that felt more like morning clothes. I sat before them, a panel of my former mentors and colleagues, their faces carefully neutral, their eyes avoiding mine. They represented the life I had sacrificed everything for. Dr. Albright, who had guided my hands during my first solo surgery. Dr. Chun, with whom I had published papers. These were the people whose respect I had spent my life earning. And I had thrown it all away in a single catastrophic moment of pride and exhaustion. They asked their questions and I answered in a monotone, recounting the cascade of errors with a detached precision that felt obscene. I didn't make excuses. I didn't blame my lack of sleep. I simply laid my failure bare on that polished table for them to dissect. The core conflict, the true injustice, wasn't happening in that room. While they debated the terms of my suspension, while they weighed the risk I posed to the hospital's reputation, a different kind of verdict was being reached inside of me. The shocking truth was this: as the world was methodically stripping away my professional identity, a fragile, unfamiliar sense of peace was beginning to take root in my soul. Every hour I wasn't in surgery or preparing for this hearing, I had spent in the silence of the hospital chapel. I didn't know what I was doing, but I kept going back. I would just sit there letting the guilt wash over me, and for the first time I felt I wasn't bearing it alone. The injustice was that this panel of my peers could only judge my actions. They couldn't see the war and now the tentative truce that was raging in my soul. Have you ever had to face the music? That formal moment of judgment, where your fate is being decided by people who only have a fraction of the story. You sit there, nodding, accepting the consequences, while your inner world is a universe they couldn't possibly comprehend. They see the mistake, but they don't see the sleepless nights that led to it. They see the failure, but they don't see the agonizing, soul-searching remorse that follows. You let them pass their sentence, all the while knowing that the real judgment, the one that truly matters, is happening in a court they will never have access to. You are being tried on two completely different levels, and only one of them offers the possibility of grace. I walked out of that conference room before they had made their final decision, leaving my fate in their hands. The outcome, whether it was suspension or termination, almost felt irrelevant. My identity as Dr. Carter, top surgeon, was already dead. The promise, the tiny flicker of light in the overwhelming darkness, was the possibility of what might rise from the ashes. In losing everything I thought I wanted, I was being given something I never knew I needed. The guilt was still there, a heavy cloak I would carry for the rest of my life. But now it felt as though someone was helping me bear the weight. And the prayer that came to me wasn't a plea for a lighter sentence from the board, but for a different kind of strength entirely. Lord, give me the courage to face what I've done, and the grace to keep going. The longest walk I ever took wasn't down a hospital corridor during a code blue, nor was it the walk toward the panel that held my career in its hands. It was the 27 steps from the nurse's station to the small, quiet consultation room where Liam's mother was waiting for me. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and run. The surgeon in me, the part that craved control and fled from failure, wanted to hide. But the broken woman who had sat in the chapel at dawn knew this was a walk she had to make. My hands were clammy, my heart hammering against my ribs with a force that felt like it might do its own damage. This was a different kind of fear. In surgery, fear was an adversary to be conquered with skill and adrenaline. This was a holy terror, a fear born of shame and the bone-deep knowledge that I was about to stand before the person I had wronged most in the world. The sacrifice required here wasn't my career or my reputation. Those were already gone. The sacrifice was my pride, my last remaining shield. I had to walk into that room completely undefended, as nothing more than the woman who had taken her son. I pushed the door open. She was sitting by the window, looking out at a gray Chicago sky, her shoulders slumped. When she turned to look at me, her eyes were hollowed out by a grief so profound it felt like a physical presence in the room. There were no words. What could I possibly say? It was a mistake? I was tired. Every possible explanation was a selfish insult in the face of her loss. The core conflict was the gaping chasm between the apology I owed and the utter inadequacy of any words I could offer. The shocking injustice was that I, the one who caused this infinite pain, would be the one to ask for something from her, for a moment of her time, for her to listen. The scales were so horrifically unbalanced. I stood there, and the silence stretched, thick with unspoken agony. Finally, the only two words that mattered broke from my lips in a choked whisper. "I'm sorry." Have you ever had to apologize for something you can't fix? Not for being late or breaking a dish, but for shattering something irreplaceable in someone's life. You know the feeling. The words feel like ash in your mouth. Your throat closes up, your mind goes blank, and you are terrified of the look you will see in their eyes. The anger, the hurt, the cold indifference. You stand there, utterly exposed, offering a handful of words to mend a wound that is miles deep. It is the most humbling, most terrifying act of vulnerability a human being can perform. Those two words broke the dam. Tears streamed down my face, and to my astonishment, tears began to fall from her eyes too. We didn't speak. We just cried together. Two women on opposite sides of a tragedy, united for a moment in shared sorrow. When she finally spoke, her voice was raspy. "During the surgery," she said, looking at me directly for the first time, "I was in the chapel. I was praying for his heart. And then I felt this strange urge, and I started praying for the doctor's hands." She took a shaky breath. "I don't hate you, doctor. I'm just so sad." Her forgiveness wasn't a pardon. It didn't erase the guilt. But it was an act of grace so profound it felt like a physical release, a cracking of the stone that had been encasing my heart. It was a promise that even in the deepest darkness, a flicker of human grace could survive. Thank you for softening hearts, hers and mine. For every one life I had failed, there were hundreds I had saved. For 20 years, that statistic had been my shield, my justification, my source of pride. But in the suspended silence of my empty apartment, the single failure weighed more than all the successes combined. The one ghost of the boy I lost was louder than the entire chorus of lives I had pulled back from the brink. The scales of my soul were broken, and my life's work felt like it had been reduced to a single unforgivable error. The days of my suspension bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of a sun I barely noticed. Stripped of my scrubs, my pager, my purpose, I was adrift. I had sacrificed my youth, my relationships, and my peace of mind for my work. I had poured every ounce of my being into becoming the best, believing that my skill was a fortress that would protect me from failure and doubt. But now, sitting in the quiet wreckage of my life, I saw that the fortress had been a prison, and the sacrifice had left me with nothing but empty hands and the echoing memory of a flatlining heart monitor. My past wasn't a comfort, It was a long list of things I had given up for a career that now lay in ruins. One sleepless night, driven by a need I didn't understand, I found myself going through old patient files I had stored on my personal laptop. I scrolled past names and faces, each one a ghost from a former life. Then I stopped on one, a teenage girl from a horrific car crash years ago, her insides a mangled mess. The team had been ready to give up. I remembered refusing, pushing for another hour, then another, my hands working on pure instinct long after my mind was exhausted. She survived. She's in college now. Then there was the newborn with a heart so tangled it looked like a puzzle with no solution. A 14-hour surgery. He just started kindergarten. Case after case, I saw these miracles. These moments I had attributed solely to my own skill and relentless determination. The shocking truth, the revelation that hit me in the gut, was that my skill alone couldn't account for all of it. In those moments of impossible success, I hadn't been the master artist. I had been the brush. The injustice was my own blinding arrogance. For 20 years, I had been taking sole credit for miracles that had been flowing through me, not from me. Have you ever looked back on your life, at the moments of improbable luck or unearned success, and dismissed them as your own doing? You get the promotion and you tell yourself it was your hard work alone, ignoring the mentor who championed you. You survive a near miss on the highway and call it good reflexes, not a moment of pure, unexplainable grace. We are so quick to claim ownership of our victories, to build our identities on the foundation of our own strength. But have you ever dared to ask, just for a moment, if you were simply a channel for something greater? Have you ever considered that your greatest successes were not your achievements but your assignments? Looking at those files, the narrative of my life began to shift. My past was no longer a monument to my success or a tombstone for my failure. It was a testament to something else. My hands, which I had cursed for their fatal error, had also been instruments of profound healing. The failure was mine, a result of my pride and exhaustion. But the successes, they were a shared victory. This realization didn't erase the pain of losing Liam, but it recontextualized it. My brokenness didn't disqualify me, simply made me human. It made me a tool that now understood its own fragility, and in that understanding perhaps I could be of better service. The promise was no longer about rebuilding my old career, but about starting a new one with a new partner. Use me, God. Even my brokenness, use it to heal. Walking back into the hospital felt like visiting the ghost of a life I used to live. The familiar smell of antiseptic, the squeak of sneakers on linoleum, the urgent, impersonal voice on the overhead pager, it was all the same, but I was irrevocably different. Before, this place was my kingdom, a stage for my ambition. Now it felt like a mission field, and I was the most unqualified missionary imaginable, returning to the very place where my old gods had crumbled to dust. My colleagues' reactions were a gauntlet of quiet judgment. There were the whispers that stopped the moment I turned a corner, the quick, pitying glances that were almost worse than outright scorn, and the forced, awkward smiles from those who didn't know what to say. I was no longer Dr. Carter, the celebrated surgeon. I was a cautionary tale, a pariah. Every hallway was a reminder of the reputation I had sacrificed, every operating room a monument to the failure that now defined me in the eyes of my peers. To walk these halls again, to willingly place myself back in the heart of my own humiliation, was the hardest sacrifice yet. It required me to shed the last vestiges of my pride and accept my new identity as a broken healer. But as I began to see patients again, a new and startling conflict emerged. I was looking at them with different eyes. Before, a patient was a puzzle to be solved, a collection of symptoms, test results, and anatomical problems. I saw the disease, Now, for the first time, I saw the person. I saw the terror in the eyes of a man waiting for a biopsy result. I saw the crushing weariness on a wife's face as she sat by her husband's bedside. The shocking truth that hit me was not that I had been a bad surgeon, but that I had been an incomplete one. The entire system I had thrived in, the system I had helped perpetuate, was designed to treat the body with brutal efficiency, but it often left the soul to bleed out in silence. The greatest injustice wasn't the whispers in the hall. It was the profound loneliness I now saw in every hospital bed. Have you ever returned to a place from your past? An old workplace, a childhood home, only to find that while the place itself hasn't changed, you have been fundamentally altered? You see everything through a new lens. You notice the cracks in the walls you never saw before. You hear the unspoken sadness in conversations you used to ignore. You realize you were once moving through that world half asleep, and now, for better or worse, you are wide awake. That was me. I couldn't unsee the fear. I couldn't unhear the silent pleas for comfort. My old way of being a doctor, detached, clinical, efficient, was no longer possible. I started doing things the old Dr. Carter never would have dreamed of. I lingered for an extra minute after a consultation, not to discuss medical data, but just to listen. I pulled a chair up to a bedside and simply sat with a patient in silence. One afternoon, with an elderly woman terrified of her upcoming surgery, I found myself asking, "Would it be okay if I prayed for you?" The look of shocked, grateful relief on her face was a revelation. In that moment, I healed something that no scalpel could ever touch. It was a promise of a new way forward. The purpose of my return wasn't to reclaim my old glory, but to discover a new, more profound definition of healing, one that began long before the first incision and continued long after the wound had closed. Help me heal with words, with presence, with love, not just with steel. The loneliest place in a hospital isn't the morgue or an empty waiting room in the middle of the night. The loneliest place is at the top. For 20 years, I had cultivated an aura of untouchable competence. I was Dr. Carter, the surgeon who didn't fail, the rock in the storm. That persona required a deliberate, guarded isolation. It was a lonely pedestal, and the fall from it had been a long one. Now, wandering the hospital as a ghost of my former self, that loneliness was a cold, constant companion. The invitation came from a nurse named Maria, a kind, older woman with eyes that saw more than most. She had watched my quiet transformation, my lingering with patients, my frequent visits to the chapel. One morning, she approached me not with pity, but with a simple handwritten note. "We meet in the chapel, Wednesdays at 6 a.m. if you want." There was no pressure, just an open door. The sacrifice was immense. To walk into that room would be the final public admission of my own inadequacy. It meant showing my colleagues the broken pieces of the woman who used to be their unflappable leader. My pride, what was left of it, screamed at me to refuse, to maintain the last shred of my old, isolated dignity. I went. I stood outside the chapel door, my hand trembling, feeling like an imposter. The core conflict was a war inside my own head. The voice of the old Dr. Carter sneered, "What are you doing? This is weakness. This is admitting you can't handle it." But another, quieter voice whispered, "You can't handle it. Not alone." I pushed the door open and slipped into a back pew. Inside were a handful of people, 2 nurses, a resident, and anesthesiologist I recognized, their scrubs rumpled, their faces etched with the familiar fatigue of the night shift. The shocking truth, the injustice that my old worldview couldn't comprehend, was that I wasn't the only one. These strong, capable people, these pillars of science and medicine, were also carrying silent burdens. We were taught that to be a healer you had to be invincible, but here was a room full of healers admitting they needed healing too. Haven't you ever felt that you were the only one struggling? You walk into your office, your classroom, or even a family gathering, wearing a carefully constructed mask. The mask says, "I'm fine. Everything's under control." But beneath it, you feel like you're cracking apart. You look at everyone around you, and they all seem so put together, so confident, so strong. You feel a profound sense of isolation, believing you are uniquely flawed, uniquely broken. What would happen, you wonder, if you took off the mask? Would they run? Or would you discover that they are all wearing masks of their own? They didn't ask me to speak. They simply went around their small circle sharing brief, quiet requests. Pray for my patient in room 312. Pray for my son's fever. Pray for me, I'm just so tired. When it was my turn, I simply shook my head, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. And they just nodded, understanding. In their acceptance, in their shared vulnerability, I felt a burden lift that I didn't even realize I was still carrying. It wasn't the guilt, that was mine to bear. It was the crushing weight of loneliness. My faith didn't erase my mistake, but this community, this circle of flawed, praying people, promised I wouldn't have to carry the aftermath alone. Thank you for holding me up when I can't stand alone. It was a Tuesday morning, 6 months after I had destroyed another Tuesday morning forever. The head of surgery called me into his office. There was a little girl in the pediatric ICU, he said, a complex case with a high mortality risk. The assigned surgeon had fallen ill. I was the most qualified. I was up. The words hit me like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. The room tilted. It wasn't just a surgery, it was an echo. A little girl. High risk. My hands. The ghost of Liam, which had been a constant, quiet shadow, was suddenly a screaming phantom right in front of me, its voice the sound of a flatlining heart monitor. My first instinct was to say no. To run. The old Dr. Carter would have seen this as a challenge, a chance to prove herself. But the new Emily, the broken Emily, was terrified. My hands felt cold and clumsy. My mind flooded with a paralyzing loop of my last fatal mistake. Saying yes to this surgery felt like putting a gun to my own head. The sacrifice wasn't about my career anymore. It was about my sanity. I had just begun to piece my soul back together, and now I was being asked to walk back into the very fire that had melted me down, to risk not only another child's life but my own fragile recovery. The core conflict was no longer a battle against my own pride, but a battle against my own terror. I stood in the hallway, the surgical file in my hands, feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The shocking, cruel injustice of it all felt overwhelming. It felt like a test, a brutal one. You want to trust me? A voice in my head, a voice I couldn't tell was God's or my own doubt, seemed to say, "Fine. Walk through your worst nightmare again. Let's see how strong your new faith really is." The truth was, faith hadn't erased my fear. It hadn't imbued me with some supernatural calm. It had simply made me excruciatingly aware of how powerless I truly was, and right now that awareness was excruciating. Have you ever been forced to face the source of your deepest trauma? You survive a car crash, and for the first time you have to get back behind the wheel. You have your heart broken, and you have to decide whether to risk trusting someone again. Your body tenses, your palms sweat, your mind screams at you to retreat to safety. Every cell in your being remembers the pain and wants to protect you from it. The world tells you to be brave, to get back on the horse. But they don't understand the sheer force of will it takes just to stand your ground, to breathe, and to not let the past swallow you whole. This time, however, I did something different. I didn't push the fear down. I didn't pretend it wasn't there. I acknowledged it, I let it wash over me, and then I took it with me. I walked, with the file still in my hand, straight to the one place I knew I could take it. The empty chapel. I didn't pray for success. I didn't bargain with God for the girl's life. I just knelt, held the file, and prayed for my hands to be guided by something better than my own fallible skill. I prayed for peace. When I walked into that the fear was still my co-pilot, but it was no longer in control. The surgery was long, delicate, and demanding. But through it all, there was a quiet undercurrent of calm. And when the final suture was tied, when the monitors showed a steady, stable heartbeat, a wave of relief so profound washed over me that my knees felt weak. Later, alone in the break room, I cried. Not tears of guilt or shame, but tears of staggering, overwhelming gratitude. It was a promise that my work and my healing could continue. Every heartbeat is a gift. Thank you for letting me witness another miracle. My greatest strength as a surgeon was no longer my hands. It was the story of how they had failed. I was standing at a podium in the hospital's main auditorium for grand rounds, the weekly meeting where complex cases were presented and dissected. It was a theater of intellectual combat and medical prowess, a place to showcase brilliance, not to confess your sins. On the screen behind me was a slide detailing the successful high-risk surgery I had performed on the little girl from the ICU. This was supposed to be my comeback story, my public redemption. And all I could think about was the story that wasn't on the slides. The hospital leadership had orchestrated this. They wanted to put the Liam Miller incident behind them. And what better way than to showcase Dr. Carter, back on her feet, performing miracles again? They were offering me a golden opportunity to reclaim my old identity, to let everyone see that I was still the same brilliant surgeon. The sacrifice would be to let them. It would be so easy to just present the case, accept the polite applause, and let the narrative of my failure be buried under this new success. All I had to do was stick to the script. But standing there, looking out at the faces of my colleagues, I knew that accepting that easy redemption would be the most profound betrayal of all, a betrayal of Liam, of his mother, and of the God who had met me in my brokenness. I clicked through the slides of the successful surgery, explaining the complex procedure with the detached clarity I was known for. I reached the final slide, a picture of the smiling girl now recovering. The room was ready for the conclusion. This was my moment to step back into the light. But the core conflict was raging within me. The shocking truth that had become my new creed was that the culture of medicine, this unspoken code of silent suffering and feigned invincibility, was a lie. It was a poison that isolated us, that encouraged us to burn out in silence, rather than admit our humanity. And in that moment, I knew I couldn't be complicit in that lie any longer. This surgery, I said, my voice wavering for a moment, was only possible because of a surgery I failed. A hush fell over the room. I took a deep breath and told them everything. I told them about Liam, about my burnout, my arrogance, and the fatal mistake. I told them about the rooftop in the chapel. I laid my shame bare under the bright auditorium lights. Have you ever been given a stage, a moment where everyone is looking at you, expecting one story, while your soul is screaming to tell another? You have a choice. You can deliver the polished, impressive narrative, the one that makes you look good, the one that everyone wants to hear. Or you can tell the truth, the messy, vulnerable, scarred truth, the one that risks judgment, misunderstanding, and pity, the one that makes you feel terrifyingly exposed. It is the choice between protecting your image and liberating your soul. And in that moment, you realize that true strength isn't about having no scars. It's about having the courage to show them. When I finished, there was a heavy silence. I expected to see scorn, pity, or embarrassment. Instead, I saw faces of deep, somber understanding. Later, as people were filing out, Maria, the nurse who had invited me to the prayer group, came up to me. Her eyes were wet with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "I've been praying, but I felt so alone in it, so ashamed to need it." Not anymore. Her words were a promise, a revelation. My story was no longer just about my shame. It had become a permission slip for someone else to be honest about their own struggles. God hadn't erased my failure. He had transformed it. He had taken my deepest wound and turned it into a source of healing for someone else. Turn my shame into testimony, so others may find hope too. My sanctuary is no longer the operating room. It's not the sterile, controlled world of beeping monitors and sharp steel where I once felt like a god. My sanctuary is here, in the quiet of the hospital chapel at dawn, a place I once would have walked past without a second glance. The woman who used to start her day with a triple-shot espresso and a grim recitation of her surgical schedule now starts it here, on a simple wooden pew, watching the sun cast its gentle colors through the stained glass windows. This new beginning did not come without a final, profound sacrifice. The sacrifice was the ghost of my ambition. It was the desire to be seen as brilliant, to be revered, to be the surgeon who came back from a fatal error stronger than ever. I had to let that woman die. I had to accept that my story was not one of heroic redemption, but one of quiet, humble grace. I had to trade the roar of applause in an auditorium for the stillness of this room. In the eyes of the world, I am a lesser surgeon than I was before. More cautious, less arrogant, marked by a failure that will follow me forever. But in the quiet of my own soul, I have never been more whole. The core conflict of my entire life was the belief that I had to be perfect to be worthy. Worthy of respect, worthy of my title, worthy of love. The final shocking truth I learned is that God's economy works in reverse. My worthiness wasn't found in my strength, but in the surrender of it. My healing didn't begin when I succeeded again. It began when I confessed that I had failed. The scar from Liam's death will never fade. It is etched onto my heart. But it is no longer a mark of shame. It is a holy scar, a permanent reminder not of what I lost, but of what I found in the wreckage. It is the place where the light of grace gets in. And maybe this is your story too. Maybe you carry scars of your own, failures you can't undo, words you can't take back, regrets that feel like a physical weight. You look at your life and see a ledger that seems impossibly unbalanced, a debt you can never repay. You strive for a perfection that always feels just out of reach, all while hiding the broken parts of yourself for fear that if anyone saw them, they would see you as unworthy. What if your greatest strength isn't in hiding your scars, but in letting them remind you of your need for grace? What if your healing begins the moment you stop trying to be perfect and simply allow yourself to be loved as you are? I don't know what today will bring. There may be more long surgeries, more difficult cases, more moments of fear and doubt. My faith is not a shield that makes me immune to the hardships of this life. It is an anchor. It doesn't stop the storm from raging, but it holds me steady in the midst of it. As the sun climbs higher, casting a warm glow over the city, I feel a sense of peace that I once would have thought impossible. It is not the peace of a life without problems, but the peace of a soul that knows it is not walking alone. The story doesn't end. It just begins again with every sunrise. Lord, I don't know what tomorrow brings, but today I choose to trust you. The journey of Dr. Emily Carter is more than a story of a mistake in an operating room. It is a journey from the pinnacle of pride to the valley of brokenness, only to find grace in the last place she expected. Her story reminds us that the deepest healing often comes not from our successes, but from how we face our failures. That even in our most profound brokenness, a new and beautiful purpose can be forged when we allow faith to lead. Perhaps you in your own life are carrying a scar, a quiet pain, a failure you think can never be forgiven. Perhaps you feel that your story has been defined by its darkest chapters. If this story touched you, please leave a prayer for yourself or someone in need in the comments below. Share this story with someone you believe needs to hear this message of hope and healing. Or simply comment Amen as an affirmation that you are not alone on your journey of faith. Because even from the broken pieces, God still writes stories of redemption.